Hi everyone, and thank you for participating in this Asian Studies course. I'm Lucy Glasspool, Associate Professor at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies, Department of English and Contemporary Society. Today I'll be discussing how the theory and practices of Orientalism have influenced the international dissemination of Japanese pop culture, and how the Japanese government and media industries use pop culture to support or seek to alter imaginings of Japan domestically and overseas. To begin, I'll outline the theory and features of Orientalism, followed by discussing why and to what extent it might apply to Japan. I'll then explore how Orientalist ideology, consciously or unconsciously, informs the use of Japanese pop culture as a nation branding strategy in different regions. Finally, I'll touch on how the images perpetuated in such cultural texts still affect minorities in Japan today. Most people in the developed world have an impression of Japan that comes in part from the media text we use. Of course, this impression may differ according to factors like location, age, and the level of interest in and familiarity with Japanese culture. However, there are a number of common discourses on Japan and Japaneseness that are propagated not only in international media, but also by Japanese cultural and governmental institutions. When we look a little closer, one thing that many common images of Japan appear to share is an echo of Orientalism. First, let's have a brief overview of the concept of Orientalism. This is an idea famously outlined by the post-colonial scholar Edward Said in his seminal text of the same name in 1978. He gave three main definitions for the concept of Orientalism. First, and most simply, it means the study of the Orient. But as Said points out, this begs the questions of what or where is the Orient? This is addressed in his second definition. Orientalism is a way of constructing and then promoting the idea of difference between the Orient and Occident. However, these entities are not inert facts of nature, they are social constructions. Historically, those constructing the difference have been Western cultures, the so-called Occident, framing the East, the Orient, as an other, in order to construct their own cultural identity in opposition to that other. So, what kind of other has the Orient been imagined as? Said's third definition states that Orientalism is a discourse created by Western scholars, politicians, figures of public influence, a discourse of the inferiority of Eastern cultures compared to the West, setting up a binary in which the Orient is the object and the Occident the subject in an uneven power relationship. This was not merely to create positive self-identities for Western cultures, it also had a practical purpose for colonial regimes, making the domination and rule of Oriental nations more palatable to the Western public and legitimizing efforts towards colonization. The image of the other created by Orientalist discourse is composed of several facets. The exotic, far away and mysterious, but also attractive because of this. The unfamiliar architecture, animals, costumes, and people generate interest. It is uncivilized, demonstrating a need for guidance by more developed cultures. The lack of civilization can be characterized as backwards, brutal, barbarous, cruel, and so on, such as this image of an unrestrained religious celebration, or this one, depicting the murder of several concubines. The next element is the sensual. The idea that Oriental peoples operate through body and emotions, particularly pleasure, rather than mind and reason. Foucault explains this in the perceived attitudes to sex of the colonial Orient and the Occident. The Eastern ars erotica, the erotic arts, versus Western scientia sexualis, the science of sexuality. This comes out in colonial art, Orientalist art, particularly in the image of the harem. And this is connected to the last element I'll talk about, the feminine. This is characterized as passive and weak, in contrast to the West's strong and aggressive masculinity. And this manages to somehow coexist as a dichotomy with the brutal and cruel stereotype of the uncivilized. Orientalism for Said is a historical phenomenon, a way of thought, a contemporary problem, and a material reality. Said was referring largely to Western European nations' attitudes towards their objects of colonization, for example, the British in India or the French in Morocco, though he also discussed 20th century American relations with Korea, Japan, Native Americans, and so on. So, where does Japan sit within Orientalism? How does this historical phenomenon inform images of Japan in the world today, as depicted in Japanese and overseas pop culture? First, let's see how far the model of Orientalism applies to Japan. Said focused on cultures that were targets for colonization in a broadly West versus Rest binary, and in a geographical sense, Japan can be said to fall within this. But they were the objects of political, military, and economic control by colonial powers, and in this sense, we can't say Japan has been strictly Orientalized, as it was never a colony. But it did experience Western occupation by the US in the post-World War II period, and wartime representations of Japan in Allied propaganda certainly painted Japan as a barbaric other, an other that is wholly unlike the West and the Western people. On the other hand, Japan is in the somewhat rare position of having also been an active colonizer of other Asian nations before being occupied by a Western power. And to a certain extent, it's employed an Orientalist discourse towards the countries under its rule. It's this position as both occupier and occupied that scholar Koichi Iwabuchi finds so interesting in terms of Japan's own national identity and its use of pop culture to promote a particular image of itself. Iwabuchi's 2002 work, Recentering Globalization, reframed the idea of flows of cultural globalization, which has typically been thought of as from the West to the rest, pointing out the importance of Japan as a center disseminating culture, technology, and so on to East Asia, and more recently to the rest of the world. Japan's national identity is constructed through its historical relationships with both the West and East and Southeast Asia, says Iwabuchi. It positions itself against the West, which brought a particular form of modernity when Japan opened its doors after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, later becoming an occupier of Japan in the post-war period. In this sense, Japan was the object of Orientalism. It is different from the West and other, and has selectively acknowledged some advantages of Western modernity. At the same time, Japan frames itself in relation to the rest of Asia. Japan and Asia tend to be discussed in Japan as two separate things, a within but above Asia attitude based on Japan's history as a colonizer, providing less advanced Asian nations with superior Japanese culture, as well as with aspects of Western culture. Sobun Tae argues that the Japanese media has not played a significant role in helping to broaden the map of Asia that exists in the Japanese consciousness. Rather, representations of Asia in the Japanese media tend to be skewed, protecting long-held stereotypes. The recent ascendancy of K-pop is disrupting this narrative, as I'll talk more about later, but scholars like Thomas Baudonnet point out that K-pop is actually used by some, for example young Japanese gay men, to frame Korea as an attractively wild and beastly vision of Japan's past. Thus, Japan's modern national identity has always been imagined as an asymmetrical triad between Asia, the West, and Japan, incorporating the power relations of both Orientalizer and Orientalized. For example, this building, constructed by the Japanese for the 1915 exposition in Korea, which blocks the view of Korea's historic palace, and at the same time introduced an idea of Korea as old and stagnant, in contrast to Japan's new Western knowledge. It's also been Orientalized, for example in this famous and much lambasted novel by Arthur Golden, Memoirs of a Geisha. And this dichotomy, or this relationship between Orientalizer and Orientalized, can be seen in the different ways Japan has mobilized its pop culture as part of its nation branding strategies using soft power, in order to promote a positive national image and thereby gain economic, diplomatic, and cultural benefits. Through a combination of government, industry, and media influence, Japan's popular culture has been used to shape the image of the country, both outside and within Japan. And to some extent, this has mirrored Iwabuchi's idea of an asymmetrical triad based on Orientalist discourse, in the form of pop culture trends and strategies aimed at the West, aimed at the East, that is, East and Southeast Asia, and aimed at a domestic Japanese audience. I'd like to outline some of the key features of Japanese pop culture exports in each region, bearing in mind that these regions aren't an inert fact of nature, but shift according to who is defining them, to take a look at how pop culture has shaped people's imaginings of Japan. Western fascination with Japanese culture first peaked with the Japonism trend in Western Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. Many Impressionist artists lauded the beauty of Japanese aesthetics and incorporated them into their own work, especially in the female form, as you see here. The second wave could be said to be the post-war exports to the USA in the form of highly localized films like Godzilla. Since then, the export of Japanese popular culture to the USA and Western Europe, in addition to a thriving tourism industry, has become a significant economic source for Japan. It can also be said that the particular types of cultural product that are exported help construct common images of Japan and Japaneseness in Western imaginations. While there is, in fact, a great variety of Japanese pop culture texts enjoyed by Western fans, a few distinct trends have emerged within wider media discourse, and these trends have helped cement an Orientalist image of Japan. The most common Japanese pop culture exports to Western countries are video games, by a large margin, anime, manga, and related aspects like cosplay culture. In popular consciousness and Western mass media, anime has come to be the presumed representative of Japanese pop culture. Although in the fan world, a wide variety of anime and manga genres are translated and actively consumed online, the most well-known have been from the fantasy, sci-fi, or Japanese historical genres, rather than the plethora of more domestic or mundane settings found within manga and anime. There are some exceptions, such as sports anime, or everyday settings made extraordinary by the presence of fantasy, as in Sailor Moon. This is partly due to the difficulties of localization for slice-of-life genres, in which an understanding of Japanese society is more necessary to the enjoyment of the audience, for example, workplace or school stories. But it also conveys a sense of high excitement and fantasy, even in narratives of historical events, that render users' imaginings of Japan exotic and unknowable. The same effect can be found in the active promotion and taking up in the Western press of so-called Harajuku fashions, varieties of gyaru, lolita, genderless, and so on. Japanese mainstream fashion is more along the lines of the casual, unremarkable style of Uniqlo and Superdry. But when Western mass media showcases Japanese fashion, it is the more flamboyant genres that are chosen as representatives. The exoticism highlighted in both Japanese cultural exports and Western media contributes to what Wester Wagner calls wacky Orientalism. This very specific form of Orientalism refers to the way 21st century Japan is framed in the West as weird, eccentric, and bizarre. Wagner suggests that, like more traditional forms of Orientalism, this wackiness is a framing of Japan in order to help Western cultures define themselves as normal. But it's also the case that Japanese organizations and cultural industries actively exploit this by promoting niche aspects of the culture rather than the everyday. In this sense, Japan is not merely a passive Orientalized object. Japan's image of exotic bizarreness may come with some drawbacks, but at the same time has various economic and nation branding benefits. Within Orientalism, femininity has historically been deployed by the Orientalizer to describe the softness and weakness of the Orientalized. It's therefore interesting that Japan has used female and traditionally feminine images to represent itself so often, to the extent that this has become one of the primary ways in which Japan is imagined in the West, especially through pop culture. Femininity in Japanese pop culture is embodied in the concept of kawaii. Often translated in English as cuteness, this is a positive term with multiple nuances, including youth, innocence, softness, femininity, simplicity, vulnerability, and inexperience. Sharon Kinsella explains that it can be used to describe anything, from food to fashion to mascots, but especially people. Toddlers, baby animals, and frail old ladies are the natural models for kawaii. In practice, kawaii can be used to describe almost anything. Hello Kitty, popular worldwide, exemplifies a distilled form of kawaii. But it is the image of the young woman that has often come to officially and unofficially represent Japan. The oft-critiqued Cool Japan initiative by Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or MOFA, is a government industry cultural diplomacy project dating from 2006. This is a periodically rebooted nation branding strategy, most lately in the run-up to the Tokyo Olympics, seeking to increase tourism and construct an image of Japan as a cultural power on the world stage. Cool Japan in practice covers many aspects of Japanese culture, from the traditional, like temples, geisha, cuisine, heritage sites, to pop, anime, manga, games, fashion, street food, and characters, to the futuristic, robots, AI, and other cutting-edge tech. In 2009, MOFA designated a trio of trend communicators of Japanese pop culture to spread awareness of Japanese pop culture abroad. 3 young models and designers known as the Ambassadors of Kawaii. Dressed in emblematic styles of Japanese femininity, the schoolgirl, the lolita, and the generic Harajuku fashion, they became an officially sanctioned face of the Cool Japan campaign overseas. Laura Miller argues that a problem with adopting this image of kawaii femininity to represent Japan is that it takes an aesthetic concept, kawaii, that was created by women for women, and harnesses it for an overwhelmingly elite male-led project of cultural diplomacy. A project that, in terms of pop culture, tends to promote male or otaku geek culture by minimizing the roles of women as creators and innovators in favor of displaying women as characters and commodities. In addition, kawaii is only one of the many types of Japanese femininity, and with its nuances of simplicity and vulnerability, serves to uphold Orientalist notions of both women and the East as lacking in strength. These representations of Japan as kawaii and feminine have repercussions not only in the continued Western fetishization of subservient Asian women, but also the tangential discourse of the Asian male as insufficiently masculine. Connected to the idea of femininity is the sensual. Sensuality in Orientalism is placed upon a culture to add to its image of exoticism and lack of advanced civilization. Added to the old discourse of subservient models of femininity catering to largely male comfort, such as geisha or maid cafes, both of which actually cater to female clients too, Japanese pop culture in Western public consciousness certainly contains a component of perceived eroticism. Sexual anime and manga aimed at both women and men are thriving targets for export and localization in the US and Europe, not to mention the live-action Japanese pornography market, while sexy schoolgirls and skimpy cosplay are frequent images in Western media. Not all of these are actively embraced as part of Japan's nation branding strategies, but neither does the official narrative deny them very strenuously, as can be seen by the appointment this year of the latest Cool Japan ambassador, #1 cosplayer and model Enako. This discourse of sexualization of Japan is once again centered on the feminine. Together with the innocence of kawaii, it sets up a familiar double standard of female sexuality. By contrast, though there are many images of cool and attractive men, not to mention the hypermasculine figure of the samurai in Japanese pop culture, Japanese masculinity is frequently depicted in Western media as somehow lacking. Narratives of sexless young men and otaku who prefer to date a 2D character instead of a real woman once again highlight the supposed yielding femininity of the Orient. This sometimes includes a component of Wagnar's wacky Orientalism, that Japanese male sexuality leans towards tentacle hentai, digital girlfriends, and schoolgirl panties. Such an image of simultaneously inadequate and deviant sexuality is of course not part of Japan's conscious cultural diplomacy, but it is a consequence of its exotic pop culture branding combined with Orientalist ideologies still active in the West. And so we come to uncivilized. This final aspect of Orientalism is perhaps the most complicated when examining Japanese pop culture in the West. Japanese cultural exports, from anime to tourism campaigns, support a particular idea of Japan's exotic uniqueness as simultaneously traditional and futuristic. From the historical architecture and geiko of Kyoto to the ultra-modern technology in Tokyo, from the period anime like Sengoku Basara to the cyberpunk and mecha genres, Japan is promoted as a country of attractive extremes, officially by the National Tourism Organization and unofficially through media discourse. This has led to the misconception in the West that Japan is a highly technological society, while in fact, although it develops technology, most people living in Japan rarely use it in their daily lives. This is something sharply illustrated in the current COVID-19 situation, where many office workers can't work from home because they need to use the office fax machine or stamp documents with their personal ink seal. Still, the image of Japan disseminated through pop culture for the moment remains at the cutting edge of technology, and therefore it can hardly be said to be uncivilized. Wester Wagoner offers a different perspective on this futuristic image through the concept of techno-Orientalism. Developed by Morley and Robbins in 1995, this is an Orientalism update, in which the West still defines itself against the other of the Orient. But in this case, Japan becomes an object of both anxiety and envy due to its technological advancement. Western cultures cannot claim Japan is backwards in the usual sense. So in techno-Orientalism, the uncivilized aspect has become, for example, dystopian stories about the coldness of technology, and Japan's punishing work culture and repressive collectivism in which people are mere machines. As Wagoner states, through techno-Orientalism, the West manages to assert moral and cultural supremacy over Japan by enforcing a conception of the country and its people as robot-like and lacking humanity. As this journalist wrote, Japanese society is already robotic in ways that other countries are not. This does not necessarily hold for fans of mecha and sci-fi anime, for example, for whom Japanese technology has a positive nuance. But if this advanced technology does not create an uncivilized image of Japan in the West, it does at least continue to highlight its otherness. Japanese pop culture exports, combined with media images about Japan created in the USA and Europe, thus to a certain extent uphold typical Orientalist ideas of the East, as well as constructing some new ones. However, for the Japanese government, culture and tourism industries, this may actually be beneficial. Japan is depicted as an exotic, unique culture with an element of mystery. It has commodified certain elements of itself that are fascinating, or at least attractive to Western consumers. This is one of the ways in which Japan has attempted to maintain its position as the cultural center and focal point of Asia. Of course, this position is constantly being contested, particularly by other countries in the East Asian region. So next we'll take a look at the extent to which Orientalist discourse is utilized to negotiate Japan's relationship with its neighbors. As mentioned before, Japan's history with other Asian countries, especially in the 20th century, has placed it in the role of colonial power, and Japanese discourse on the relationship between Japan and colonized nations such as Korea and Taiwan reinforced the idea of a superior, because advanced, colonizer, and inferior because undeveloped, colonized. During the colonial period, up to the end of World War II, this was done overtly through military and political rule and direct propaganda, and compulsory use of Japanese language, education, and cultural texts. This unsurprisingly resulted in various negative reactions to Japanese culture, For example, Iwabuchi tells us that Japanese pop culture exports were banned in South Korea from the end of the colonial period until 1998. Nevertheless, the Japanese government has been keen to export its pop culture to the Asian region, not only for the obvious industry and economic benefits, but also for the purpose of cultural diplomacy. In this case, the goal was not merely a nation branding exercise to create a positive image of Japan, but to aid in rebuilding a relationship with its ex-colonies and to plaster over its historical reputation for imperialism. So, how has Japan used pop culture to aid in this attempt? Instead of employing the Orientalist discourse utilized in the colonial period, that is, the strength, difference, and superiority of Japan, or images of Japan's exotic feminine, as shown to the West, more recent pop culture exports to East Asia have been those that showcased cultural closeness between Japan and Asia, the idea of similarity. Of course, the more fantastic genre of anime and manga have become popular too, but also live-action dramas, Japanese cosmetic brands, and pop culture stars or idols. As Wai Ming Ing points out, in 2004, due to physical and cultural proximities, Asian youths feel close to Japanese idols. They present themselves like the people next door. The J-pop idol trend in East Asia is on the decline, but it was influential in the formation of idol culture in South Korea and China. The export of the 1984 soap opera-style drama Oshin, which was distributed to various Asian countries by the Japan Foundation under the auspices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, makes deliberate use of this closeness in order to showcase the real lives of Japanese people. Such pop culture types highlight the similarity of appearance, environment, daily life, and values between Japan and the target country. It can be argued that, in a sense, this soft power form of cultural diplomacy has been successful. Japanese pop culture is quite common in South Korea, Taiwan, etc., to the extent that it does not occupy the niche position, which supports the ideology of difference, that it holds in the USA and Europe. Japanese pop culture is not exotic, it is nearby and easy to grasp. It has many Asian fans and casual users, and it's comparatively visible in mass media and cityscapes, for example in the form of idols and kawaii characters, and also novels, cosplay, and so on. The enthusiasm of East Asian users for such exports has been used by Japanese mass media to highlight the supposedly friendly relations between Japan and its ex-colonies, and their tacit acceptance of Japanese culture, such as this article, which was about the first pop concert by Japanese stars held in Korea after 1998, and it was viewed as highly significant at the time. Or these recent Newsweek specials, Why We Love Blah Blah about Japan, and there's a China edition and a South Korea edition. However, as Iwabuchi in 2006 and Nissim Osmatgin in 2012 point out, the history of colonialism and Orientalist attitudes from Japan, as well as the critical thinking skills of younger generations of East Asians, means that this commercial and diplomatic project is not unproblematic. Osmatgin states that ideas of soft power imply that images and narratives carry encoded meanings that can be read a certain way, but that the messages about Japanese culture and its closeness to other Asian cultures that the industry and government wishes to project may actually be interpreted or responded to in multiple ways. Taking the example of South Korea, in 1998 the Korean President Kim announced that the ban on Japanese cultural exports would be gradually abolished, and the opening of this new market gave rise to many celebratory articles in the Japanese press about the acceptance and reconciliation between Japan and Korea. But Iwabuchi in 2006 pointed out that young Korean fans of Japanese manga, video games, and pop music have the ability to separate their enjoyment of a cultural product from their disapproval of Japan's politics, particularly the long-standing antagonism regarding Japan's refusal to acknowledge its wrongdoings during World War II. More recently, in 2019, trade friction between the two countries resulted in a range of political and economic conflicts. While this did not affect many South Koreans' enjoyment of Japanese culture on a personal level, the tension led to widespread boycotts of Japanese products, including beer, pens, tourist destinations, celebrities, even anime like Doraemon. K-pop stars were also pressured to cancel promotion advertising contracts for Japanese products. This shows that the cultural diplomacy project of promoting a culturally close, friendly, and familiar Japan is really not that successful when political issues are in question. The periodic rejection of Japanese products exposes the fallacy that popular cultural flows will happily erase the historical memory of suffering caused by Japanese imperialism. Japan's self-positioning within Asia has long been in it but above, mobilizing its relationship with the West to highlight its both historically rich and technologically advanced status. Until the late 20th century, Japan situated itself as Asia's access point for the benefits of Western culture, i.e. modernity. It did this through its dominance in terms of cultural exports within Asia, as well as the way in which it orientalized Asia in media discourse for a domestic audience. However, in recent years, the balance of the West-Japan-Asia triad is shifting. This is in part due to Japan's continued economic problems following the end of its wealthy bubble period in the early 90s, and partly thanks to the growing ascendancy of South Korean K-pop, not only within Asia but around the world. K-pop has become as popular or more popular in Japan as Japanese pop culture was within South Korea. But crucially, it's also becoming mainstream in Western countries, with the popularity of K-dramas and idols like BTS. While manga and anime remains niche in the West, the influence of K-pop makes it difficult for Japan to maintain its imagined status as the cultural center of Asia. Daisuke Nishihara reminds us that historically, when it was necessary for the nation to insist on the uniqueness of Japan, stress was first put on the spirit of the Orient. Japan adopted a "We are Asian" policy when the nation needed cooperation from other Asian countries. However, it practiced Western-style imperialism when it ruled its neighboring colonies. We've seen the ways in which Japan has taken advantage of its unusual position within Orientalism. And this is also how it has promoted itself through pop culture in different ways depending on the audience. And one of those target audiences is Japanese. Although one of the goals of nation branding is to construct a certain image of a country to gain advantages on the world stage, Katja Valaskivi argues that branding is nevertheless first and foremost directed inward, towards the nation itself, aimed at creating a stronger, more coherent sense of the national self. In Japan, this sometimes takes the self-orientalizing form of using the Western perspective of Japan as an exotic, mysterious, and alluring culture to boost Japanese people's valuation of domestic cultural forms they may generally regard as commonplace or even unappealing. In terms of pop culture, this strategy can be seen in Japanese TV shows such as Why Did You Come to Japan?, broadcast weekly on TV Tokyo since 2013. Presented by a popular comedy duo, Banana Man, in the program journalists interview foreigners at airports around Japan, asking them why they came, and then following them on their journeys around Japan, finding out what souvenirs they bought and so on. It's narrated and commented on by foreign-born TV personalities who live and work in Japan. This idea has also been used by various Japanese YouTube channels, with videos titled, When I Came to Japan, I Was Surprised by blah blah, The Charm of Japan from Foreigners Who Love Japan, and Jealous of Japanese Names, Why Do Foreigners Like Kanji Names? This might be an uncommon topic for a show in the US and Western European media, but in Japan, the viewpoint of foreigners becomes both an affirmation that Japanese culture has appeal for people around the world, and a lens through which domestic viewers can reappraise their own country in a positive way. A similar program that specifically references the Cool Japan initiative, which is not really well known domestically, is called Cool Japan, broadcast on public stations NHK and NHK World Weekly since 2006. With the tagline, Rediscovering the Charm of Japanese Culture Unnoticed by the Japanese, the bilingual show introduces different aspects of Japanese culture to a foreign guest, then discusses them with a panel of more foreigners, the majority of whom are from Western countries. The topics range from representative Japanese pop culture like cosplay, which many Japanese people may not have had close contact with, to things like bento lunchboxes and recycling that they encounter every day. The more niche pop culture aspects, like cosplay, encapsulate the sense of mystery, strangeness, and unknowability that is one facet of self-Orientalism. By broadcasting these strange, to many Japanese people, cultural forms and asking, are they cool? The Cool Japan program renders parts of Japan exotic to its own citizens. This is amplified by the guests' expressions of excitement, affirming that yes, this is cool, and even disbelief. However, it cannot work quite the same way with topics that are everyday experiences when growing up in Japan. To maintain a sense of wonder and rediscovery of Japan's uniqueness, when introducing mundane items like bento, the program uses two techniques. First, it chooses extreme examples of the topic, like this mother who wakes up at 3:30 a.m. every day to craft intricate character bento for her husband and children. This behavior is outside the experience of most Japanese viewers, sparking surprise and disbelief. After the example is introduced, there's a discussion with foreign guests in the studio, including the guest who participated in the first segment. The guest comments are not exclusively positive, but they express a sense of wonder and, crucially, difference from their own cultures, such as this one, in France, it's just a sandwich. I can't believe it. And again, the reiteration that this is cool. Even bento you can buy anywhere are cool. Thus, from the foreign guest's point of view, the exoticness and otherness of Japanese culture is confirmed for the show's viewers. Using foreign perspectives bolsters the long-held narrative within Japan of Japanese particularity or uniqueness. The carefully edited wonder voiced by the guests on these programs reaffirms this discourse for viewers and allows it to permeate even into mundane objects and practices. While the government's Cool Japan project is not the most successful attempt at pop culture nation branding due to a certain lack of focus and reach, it demonstrates that Japanese national and cultural identity has been constructed through its conscious self-orientalizing discourse, and that this continues today. The complex position Japan takes, and has made full use of, within Orientalism has had various benefits. At the same time, the echoes of Orientalist discourse continue to have a less positive impact on the lives of certain minorities in Japan, and this also emerges through pop culture. The academic study of ethnic minorities in Japanese pop culture is not particularly widespread. Nevertheless, mixed-race Japanese have carved out a significant spot in fashion advertising in magazines, TV variety shows, and pop hip-hop music in particular. The Japanese term for such people, hafu, or half, is increasingly problematized as a form of discrimination or othering, suggesting people with only one Japanese parent are not truly or purely Japanese, which can lead to childhood bullying or prejudice when seeking certain kinds of work. This is a reflection of the ethnocentrism that forms part of Japan's self-orientalist discourse of uniqueness. Japan's relationship with Orientalism results in particular types of hafu becoming prominent in popular culture. A considerable majority have a Caucasian parent, or at least a similar appearance, incorporating idealized imaginings of the West. These models, musicians, and TV personalities are generally tall, with long limbs, high-bridged noses, and double-lidded, light-colored eyes. The most ubiquitous example today is the model Dora, who is of Japanese, Russian, and Bangladeshi descent, and can be found advertising everything from whiskey to contact lenses to men's hair removal services. Even though she's a Japanese citizen, she appeared on Why Did You Come to Japan? Though she is fluent in Japanese, she incorporates foreignness into her public persona by speaking slightly informally and acting extremely vivaciously in comparison with most young female TV talents. Visually and in her performance, she embodies the appealing points of Western difference and is hugely popular. This packaging of Dora means that, in spite of her Japanese parent and upbringing, she is not commonly thought of as regular Japanese. Shima Yoshida suggests that the popularity of Caucasian mixed-race celebrities also misrepresents the makeup of the mixed-race Japanese population. Analyzing mixed-race celebrities in 2014, Yoshida found that Western, which is to say Caucasian, hafu celebrities accounted for almost 80%, followed by a mere 13% of Asian hafu. This is almost the inverse of the actual population in Japan, where East and Southeast Asian mixed-race citizens are the great majority. The high visibility and glamorized image of Caucasian Hafu celebrities can be an advantage for non-celebrity Hafu of a similar ethnic background. On the other hand, it also leads to assumptions about them. For example, that they'll be tall and beautiful, or won't be able to speak Japanese well. The comparatively low-key representation of Asian mixed-race Japanese, particularly Southeast Asia, stems in part from Orientalist ideas of Asia as culturally inferior to Japan, and the less than favorable circumstances in which many Asian people arrived in Japan during the colonial period. This historical positioning of Asia as distinct from and inferior to Japan, combined with the lack of more exciting difference found in the idealized images of the West, leads to lower visibility in media, which in turn results in a lack of role models for many mixed-race Japanese. The younger generations of Japanese, with their increased access to a wider range of role models around the world facilitated by social media, are beginning to espouse more fluid definitions of Japaneseness. With the growing push for critical thinking skills in Japanese universities, perhaps concepts like Hafu will be interrogated by the youth who will one day be responsible for producing and critiquing Japan's cultural diplomacy policies, its nation branding, and its popular culture. In fact, this is already beginning, with mixed-race celebrities like Naomi Watanabe and Naomi Osaka providing an alternative idea of what it means to be Japanese. It will be particularly interesting to see whether the aftermath of the current COVID-19 situation will lead to shifts in globalization and cultural flows, and how this might impact the role Orientalism still plays in forming Japan's pop culture representations of the world and of itself. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments, observations. My email is on the title slide. Apologies if there was a bit of background noise, but I'm recording at home and it's not perfect conditions, as I'm sure you can appreciate. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.